Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. Alright, so for this video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. This video should be coming out on my birthday, November 19th, and this year I will be turning 28. Yay, I'm still in my 20s. So I originally thought about doing like the birthday book tag, but that's only like 7 questions, so I feel like that would go by really quickly. So I decided to do something a little bit different, and since I'm going to be turning 28 years old, I thought it would be a fun idea to talk about my 28 favorite books that I've read so far in 2021. Now, the books that I'm going to be talking about here, I'm not including rereads because, I'm obviously going to love those anyway. And this year I've been doing a lot of rereading, and honestly, most of my 5-star reads have been rereads, but I'm not going to include those here. All of these books are going to be new to me books that I read for the first time this year and that I absolutely loved. All of these books are going to be like 4.5, 5-star reads for me, and these are my favorite books of the year so far. And I'm filming this sometime in like early November, so, I still have a couple months left of reading to do, and I'm sure that like my end of the year videos will be a little different because I plan on reading some books that I anticipate being really good. So these are just my favorite books so far. My 28 favorite books of 2021 so far. All right, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Also, I'm not going to talk about these books in like from best to worst or from worst to best. I'm literally just going off of my like list of books that I've read for the year, and I'm just going in the order that I've read them. So that's the only order that I'm doing here. I'm going to try to be brief with all of these books because there's 28 books. So I'm going to try to be brief as much as possible. But the first book, one of the very first books that I read this year was from Book of the Month, and that would be The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. From what I remember about the premise, this is supposed to be sort of like a modern thriller mystery version of Jane Eyre, which I've never read Jane Eyre, so I didn't really get a lot of the connections, but the reason I loved this book and the reason I gave it 5 stars is because of the protagonist of Jane. I thought she was really cool. A lot of the times when you read a thriller, the protagonist can be kind of bland so that the reader can kind of insert themselves into their shoes. But with this one, I thought she was very fiery and she just got what she wanted and she didn't really put up with any kind of bull crap, right? So I really enjoyed her character and just the twist and the turns that this book takes towards the end of the book, I really enjoyed. And I enjoyed sort of the like open endingness. It's got a very open ending, which if a thriller can pull off a good open ending, it's fantastic, and this one does a very good job. The next book I have here is A History of What Comes Next by Sylvain Neville, which is the first book in the Take Them to the Stars series. And it's a brand new trilogy, and you might recognize the name because he was the author of The Themis Files, which is my all-time favorite trilogy, and I don't care what you say, it's my favorite trilogy. And this book, while it's not quite on the level of Themis Files, all of those books were 5 stars. This one was 4.5. It was a solid first entry into a new trilogy. And I don't really want to say too much about it because it really is one of those books, like, you should go into it not knowing a whole lot about it. But it's more of like it's sci-fi, but it takes place in various different time periods, and you follow these two very unique characters, and they're kind of on the run from something, and it's got a lot of historical events weaved into it, and I thought that was pretty cool. And while it's not as great, like my all-time favorite trilogy as The Themis Files, it's such a great book. I gave it 4.5 stars, and I can't wait for the sequel, which comes out March 2022. One of my all-time favorite authors, definitely a top 10 author for me all time, is Lisa Jewell. And a new book that came out last year that I read earlier this year was Invisible Girl. And of course, it's a mystery thriller kind of book, so I don't want to say too much about it, but, just Lisa Jewell. The reason I love her is her mysteries, while sometimes they are predictable, I read them for the atmosphere that she creates and for her character work. Those are the two things that I really enjoy about her work. And of course, this one also got 5 stars from me. I think I've read like 7 or 8 books by Lisa Jewell at this point. I've given almost all of her books 5 stars, and this one was no exception. Terrific book with a pretty cool premise, and yeah, terrific character work. As per usual, I love Lisa Jewell, and this one got 5 stars. A Stephen King book that came out earlier this year was Later, which this is one of his short kind of hard case crime novels, even though this is definitely not a hard case crime. Well, maybe. It does have a cop character, but it's definitely more of a horror/suspense story. It's kind of got a similar premise to, like A Sixth Sense, where you've got a little boy who can see dead people, right? So in that form, like, it's not very original, but Stephen King is known for taking sort of unoriginal ideas and putting his own spin on it, similar to like Salem's Lot, which is basically Dracula set in Maine, right? So he takes this premise, but he puts his own sort of twist on it, and I won't say exactly what that is, but it was very good, terrific character work, and I love that he wrote from Jamie's perspective in first person. I love when Stephen King writes in first person. I think you should do it more often, and just this book overall was just very good, and I gave it 5 stars. And I've talked about this book a lot on my channel, and I do have a very old dedicated review for it. I might try to redo it because it's very early on the channel and it's probably not good. But a book that I've talked about in length on a lot of my videos is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I tried this book out and with the audiobook, one of my all-time favorite books, probably my favorite book of the year so far. Easy 5 stars. It's definitely in my top 10 books of all time, possibly even top 5. And like I've said many times, I feel like this book was just written for me as a classic rock fan and just as a fan of just 60s and 70s music, and just the audiobook for this was fantastic. It had a full cast for all of the characters. I loved everything about this book. And right when I finished it, I immediately wanted to go back and reread it, which is very different for me because I normally, besides this year, I haven't really done a whole lot of rereading. But this is definitely, hands down, one of my favorite books of all time, a book that I will be rereading every year for the rest of my life. Another book, I won't go too much in depth here just because it's the 4th book in a very epic fantasy series. That would be Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, which is the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive. I really enjoyed this book. I have a hard time figuring out how I would rank this book because I know Way of Kings is my favorite and I know Oathbringer is my least favorite, but I don't know whether I like this book or Words of Radiance more. My initial thought is that I do like Words of Radiance more, but either way, like, all of the Stormlight books are 5 stars. Terrific character work. There was a bit in the middle that I wasn't a huge fan of where they go really in depth about the magic. That part was fine, but like, it starts out really well and it ends really well. And of course, the characters are all terrific. And just Stormlight, I love Stormlight. It's my second favorite series, and yep, this book gets 5 stars very easily. Another book that I've sort of been proselytizing to a lot of people, and I even managed to get a bunch of people to read it in October, which was a lot of fun. Probably a top 10 book for me of all time is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. one of, if not my favorite horror novel of all time. I go back and forth whether or not I like this one or Misery by Stephen King more. But man, this book is just amazing. And like I said, top 10 book for me all time. And it goes in really just interesting directions that I know a lot of people aren't a fan of, but I loved it. And I love that Stephen Chbosky took the risk to write something completely different and unexpected. And I just love everything about this book. One of my favorite horror books of all time, if not my favorite. Another fantastic book that I read this year is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, yet another Taylor Jenkins Reid book. Not the first, and it won't be the last. And this one, I will say, out of the 4 Taylor Jenkins Reid books that I've read so far this year, even though this is probably her most popular work, it might be my least favorite, which isn't saying much because I've given all of her books 5 stars. But maybe it's the book that I connect to the least, maybe. I don't know, but I still loved it anyway. Evelyn Hugo is a fantastic character, and I love all of the different time periods that we get in her life, and just exploring, the 7 husbands and just her career path, and just having her deal with a lot of different issues in her life. Just Taylor Jenkins Reid is just an amazing writer, and I love her writing. I will read anything she writes, and yeah, this is easily a 5-star book for me as well. All right, a lot of those books I mentioned were 5 stars. This one's more of a 4.5-star rate, so it wasn't perfect, but it was still very, very good. And that would be Age of War by Michael J. Sullivan. This is the 3rd book in the Legends of the First Empire series. This is probably my 2nd favorite in the 6-book series. Probably the first book would be my favorite, which I gave that book 5 stars. But this book was not a vast improvement, but it was an improvement on the 2nd book, which I thought was a little bit slower, a little bit more character-driven. This one had a better balance of character work and plot. There's a lot going on in this book, and the ending to this book is very good. One of the best endings to a fantasy book that I've read in quite a long time. A lot of things that I did not predict. I applaud this series and Michael J. Sullivan for being just very unpredictable. And yep, I love this 3rd book, and I just love Legends of the First Empire in general. 4.5 stars. Another favorite fantasy book for me, which I know is kind of unpopular, and I even have mixed feelings about it, which I'm still contemplating to this day, is The Burning God by R.F. Kuang, which is the 3rd and final book in the Poppy War trilogy. Now, I do give this book 5 stars, and I do love most of the book. In fact, I would say, a lot of people just flat out don't like the book, and they don't love the directions it goes in. I was a huge fan of it all the way up until like the last few chapters. Like 95% of this book I thought was amazing, and Rin is probably my favorite protagonist, or favorite fantasy protagonist. But just those last few chapters, I was just wondering, like, okay, well, where is this book going? How can this book wrap up, and how can it end in a good way? And the ending that I envisioned, because of the title of the story, I thought it was going to go one way, but it kind of ended in a way that I thought was more of a whimper ending. It ended in more of a whimper, and I don't know. I'm very conflicted about the ending. But overall, this book, and the ending does make sense in a way, I guess. It's just not what I expected. But it's hard to talk about this book without spoiling it. But overall, though, this whole trilogy is amazing, and I do give this book a hesitant 5 stars. Another fantastic book is You Love Me by Caroline Kepnes. This is the 3rd book in the Joe Goldberg series. Now, the first 2 books were pretty good. I think I gave both of them maybe 4 stars, if I remember correctly. But so far, this has been my favorite in the series. I gave this book 4.5 stars. Didn't get 5 stars because the ending was a little messy for me. But overall, this book was just a lot of fun. And I love the black comedy and the dark humor. And I love the fact that like you're rooting for Joe Goldberg, even though he's a terrible person. And the people that like he's surrounded by, you just loathe and you just despise, even though they're not like evil like Joe Goldberg is. They're just they're just they're just the worst, right? Like they're the worst, even though like he literally kills people. But yeah, Joe Goldberg, man, I love this series, and I will basically read anything that Caroline Kepnes writes, and I'm very interested to read the fourth book whenever that comes out, and just one of my favorite series that's going right now. 4.5 stars. Easily one of the most disturbing books I've read this year is The Butterfly Garden by Dot Hutchinson. Now, this book has a very just sick and disturbing premise where this guy basically steals girls and he draws like tattoos on women's backs, and then when he deems them ready, he kills them and like displays them in his butterfly garden. And it's very sick and twisted, but the reason why it's readable is because you get a fantastic main female character who's basically going back and describing her life in the butterfly garden. And at the beginning of the novel, you know that she somehow escaped, and you're just wondering like what happened and how she survived, essentially. And just getting her everyday life and like her attitude of like being there was just super interesting. And just, yeah, it was very disturbing. I don't recommend this to people who are queasy or who are just not into like really disturbing material. But yeah, overall, this was a very great read, and I'm probably not going to read the rest of the series because I've heard that it's not as good. So I'm just going to treat this as a standalone. And yeah, this book was very good, 4.5 stars. One of the more surprising reads for me this year was After the Quake by Haruki Murakami, which is sort of a short story collection that kind of all ties into like this earthquake that happened in Japan, I think in the 90s or something like that. Usually with Haruki Murakami short stories, they're very hit or miss. Like sometimes they're either really interesting, like what the hell did I just read? Or they're just boring as all get out and you're like, what is even the point of this? But for me, almost all of the stories we get in here were super good. I think there was one that was more on the meh side, but the other ones were just really good, and I loved them, and it really surprised me with how much I enjoyed them. So for that, I give this one 4.5 stars. This next book really got like an emotional reaction out of me, which usually doesn't happen with books. That would be The Push by Ashley Audrain. And like I said, normally books, I love horror books and I love thriller books, but a lot of the times they don't affect me emotionally just because I know it's a book, right? But for this one, there's a certain scene that just filled me with dread. And then there was a couple lines after that chapter where a character there's just certain lines of dialogue where it just gut punch. We're like, oh man, why did you have to say that? It just, oh man, this book really got to me. And just very interesting writing style, and the main character and what she has to go through, and just how she chooses to like tell the story. I just really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very unique. And like I said, just for the fact that it just got such a reaction out of me, I had to put it on the list, and I love this book, 4.5 stars. Guess what author has made it yet again? Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This one, it didn't surprise me because at this point I had already read two Taylor Jenkins Reid books, and they were both phenomenal. So I was definitely expecting this one to be great. What I got was a little less than Daisy Jones, but a little better than Evelyn Hugo. So overall, this is probably my second favorite Taylor Jenkins Reid novel. Of course, I gave it 5 stars. I loved the family dynamic, and I loved jumping back and forth between the 80s and the 50s. So kind of like, an historical book, kind of like Evelyn Hugo. But I thought the family dynamics and just the character work, again, from Taylor Jenkins Reid was phenomenal. And again, there's some scenes in here where you're like, oh man, she went there. But another point for Taylor Jenkins Reid is that she is really good with writing humor and drama and mixing the two. And just, like I said, I could gush about Taylor Jenkins Reid all day. But yeah, another 5-star read from her, Malibu Rising. The next book I have is one of the best fantasy debuts I've ever read. And I can't wait for the sequel that comes out in November, late November. And that would be The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. This book was just so unique, and I loved the characters, and I loved, like, the magic system was very weird and kind of dark, where you're taking, like, these bones and, like, doing some weird kind of stuff with them to create, like, these people to, like, help. It's very weird, but also just the characters were really good. And like the main character we get, or one of the main characters we get, kind of has amnesia, and she can't really remember a lot of chunks in her life. So she's kind of like trying to remember and trying to rediscover things. And then the other one we get is a dude who's looking for his wife. He's sort of a smuggler, and he's kind of jumping all between these different islands. And another cool part about this book is the setting, where you basically get all of these like archipelago of islands. And yeah, just this book just was fantastic, and I cannot wait for The Bone Shard Emperor, which I thought was going to come out earlier this month, but I think it's been delayed a little bit. So I'm going to be reading that later this month, and I'm actually going to be rereading this soon, and I'm very pumped. 5 stars easily. The next book I don't have a physical copy of because I lent the series out to a friend of mine who's also really enjoying the series, but I'll just hold this up as a placeholder. It's the last book in the Legends of the First Empire. This is the first book, but I'm talking about Age of what am I talking about again? Oh yeah, Age of Empire, which is the 6th and final book in the Legends of the First Empire series. Fantastic ending to the series. Not perfect, but it was 4.5 stars, and he wrapped up a lot of stuff. There's a couple things that he left more open, which I wish he would have delved into a bit more, but at the same time, it was a very satisfying ending, a lot of great character arcs, just a fantastic series, just one of my favorite fantasy series. And even though it does have a lot of sort of old and possibly like unoriginal tropes, I think he puts his own spin on it, and just the directions. Like I said, this book goes in places that I did not expect. Like reading this first book and then reading the 6th book, you're like, how the hell did we get here? But yeah, just Age of Empire, fantastic, 4.5 stars. This next book is one of the most unique horror experiences I've ever had, and that would of course be The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I got introduced to Stephen Graham Jones from Leslie from The Nerdy Narrative and Evie from She Was Only Evie. They just couldn't stop talking about him, so I was like, all right, I'll try him out. And so this was my first step into the world of Stephen Graham Jones, and I loved this book from like chapter 1. And the main character that we get of Lewis, I really I got attached to him because I had a lot in common with him. Like he was, a postal worker. He's really into basketball. And so I connected to him very quickly. But then, you get through the book and you realize that Stephen Graham Jones is very good with character work, but also weaving in kind of the moral of the story. And he's really good about having like an overall message, but also not like hand fisting it, right? So I really enjoy Stephen Graham Jones, and I've just been working my way through his books all year, and this was a terrific starting point for me. I think I initially gave it 4.5 stars, but I think retroactively I would give it 5 stars So, yeah, 5 stars. Another very cool book that I enjoyed was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. This is his sort of novelization of the movie that came out a few years ago. One of my all time favorite Tarantino movies. I've seen it a lot. And when I heard that he was writing a novelization for this book, I was like, "Ooh, that'd be really cool." And it was even more than I thought it was going to be because there's a lot of scenes that aren't in the movie that he kind of fleshes out. And there's a lot of like character work and like inner dialogue that you get that's obviously you can't really portray in a movie. And I just thought getting back into this, movie and getting back into the characters was just such a fun time. It was a blast. And I don't really recommend it to people who aren't Tarantino fans or who did not like the movie, because obviously it's very closely associated with the movie. But yeah, as a huge Tarantino fan, I loved this book, 4.5 stars. Another book that maybe it didn't surprise me, but it caught me off guard by how quickly I wanted to read this book was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This was presented to me as sort of like X-Men, where these people kind of realize that they have powers and they're able to use them in certain ways. And what initially intrigued me also was the non-linear timelines, which I love. Speaking of Tarantino, that's why I love his movies, because they're sort of non-linear. And so jumping into this book where you're jumping back and forth between different timelines, I thoroughly enjoyed this book and I could not stop reading this book. Like, I read most of this book in like a 7 hour period. And then I really wanted to finish it like really late at night, but I ended up falling asleep with only like a few chapters left. So like right when I woke up, I was like, oh, I got to figure out what happened. I got to figure it out. And so, yeah, I flew through this book and easily one of the best books I've read this year. I would give it 5 stars, and I'm very curious to see what I think about the sequel, Vengeful. I'm going to be reading that in December, so very much looking forward to that. All right, this is the last time, guys, I promise. We have yet another Taylor Jenkins Reid book, and that would be Maybe in Another Life. Now, this book kind of surprised me in a way. Not really, because like at this point I knew I loved Taylor Jenkins Reid, but I didn't really expect it to be 5 stars just because of the premise. It's more of a contemporary romance with a pretty interesting premise, kind of like dual timelines, sort of like a what if situation. Like, well, what if I went home with this guy, or what if I just didn't? And so you explore the two different paths that the woman in the book can sort of take. And I really thought that was a cool way to explore this, even though this is, like I said, more of a romance. You get wonderful characters and character work from Taylor Jenkins Reid, of course, and her very cool way of just weaving in and out of humor and drama just is spectacular. And I think I like this book even more than Evelyn Hugo, which might be unpopular, but I loved the premise and I loved the execution of it. So yeah, Taylor Jenkins Reid, of course, 5 stars. And we have another King book, which came out, I think, in August, which I have a review for. And that would be Billy Summers, which was very good. Not perfect, but I did give it 4.5 stars. I think in my overall ranking of Stephen King, I would put it somewhere in my top 30, possibly top 25. I did really enjoy it. A couple issues I had with pacing and stuff like that, but that's minor stuff. Overall, I did really enjoy the book. Probably my favorite thing about the book is just Billy Summers. He's one of the best protagonists that King has written in quite a long time, probably since something like Doomickey with Egbert Freemantle. And I also love that this book goes in directions that you can't really predict. Like, you get halfway through the book and you realize, like, oh, this is turning into a completely different story than what I signed up for. And a lot of people don't like that aspect, and they go into the book thinking it's going to be one thing, but it turns into another. Which some of his books do that, like The Dead Zone, which is my all-time favorite Stephen King book. It goes in a lot of different directions. So I do enjoy that, and I think King did it brilliantly here. And like I said, 4.5 stars, awesome. Another one of my favorite fantasy series of all time that I've kind of been going back and rereading the first two books, and now I'm kind of making my way through the series, is Song of Shattered Sand series by Bradley P. Bullio. And this is the third book in the series, Veil of Spears. Earlier in the year, I went back and reread 12 Kings and Sherakai, and With Blood Upon the Sand, and those were both 5-star rereads for me. And so I read this book for the first time this year and was very blown away by it. It wasn't as good as the first two books because you do get a character perspective that's introduced that I'm not a huge fan of, at least not as a character. He does have interesting stuff going on in the chapters, but overall, I wasn't a huge fan of that. But luckily, that's only like 5 chapters in the book, which, it's a pretty lengthy book. So yeah, this book got 4.5 stars, and I recently just read book 4, which was also very good, which I also gave 4.5 stars. And now I only have 2 books left in that series, and I kind of just want to read those now. So yeah, easily one of my favorite fantasy series. Very underrated, underhyped. And yeah, this book got 4.5 stars, and I'm very excited to finish the series either later this year or early next year. Another one of my favorite horror authors that I've been getting into in the last few years is Zoe Stage, and I got her newest book back in August, Getaway. Now for this book, it is my least favorite Zoe Stage book so far, but at the same time, I still loved it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. The reason why I didn't love it quite as much as Baby Teeth and Wonderland is that after reading Wonderland and after rereading Wonderland, I anticipated this book going in much weirder directions because Wonderland goes places that you don't really expect and you can't predict. But with this book, it was kind of more straightforward and maybe more of a thriller than a horror, although I do consider it kind of a blend of the two. So it's more straightforward, and when I was reading it, and I was kind of slightly disappointed that we weren't getting like some of the weirdness and the madness that we were getting with Wonderland. But after I kind of like poo-pooed that and I was like, just enjoy the book for what it is, I really got invested in it, and terrific character work like Zoe Stage always does. And yeah, this is an excellent book, but again, not quite as good for me as Baby Teeth and Wonderland, but still an excellent Zoe Stage book that I give 4.5 stars. This next book was a pleasant surprise for me. I went into this book kind of with low expectations, or maybe not even any expectations at all, because I really wasn't sure quite what the book was about. I just kind of went in blind off of the recommendation of Joanna, because she really loves this book, and that would be Parinissi by Susanna Clark. Now, and another reason why I was hesitant to pick this up is because she's mainly known for her tome, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I tried reading that book years ago and I DNF'd it like halfway through. But the reason I wanted to pick this book up was because it's super short, which surprised me. So I wanted to read it and just find out what it was all about and see if I enjoyed it. And like I said, I was pleasantly surprised. And initially, I give this book 4.5 stars, but it's one of those books. And Evie from She Was Only Evie, she mentioned this as well. It's one of those books, like, after you read it, it's really hard to not think about it. And, like, after I read it, I just kept thinking about, like, what maybe this book could mean and just the characters that are in it. And it's just a really thought-provoking book. So I think retroactively, I might end up giving this book 5 stars just because it was such a unique read, and again went places that I wasn't expecting, and like I said, very thought provoking and just a wonderful book. Like I really want to go back and reread this at some point in the future. One of my favorite books that I've read this year. 5 stars. Parinissi. Another book that I don't have a physical copy of, but I listened to the audiobook and did a little bit of the ebook. And again, another one of my favorite horror authors that I've been introduced to this year is Stephen Graham Jones with My Heart is a Chainsaw. I absolutely loved this book, mainly because of the main character of Jade. She's probably one of the best protagonists that I've read this year. Amazing. I just, oh man, I just want to gush and gush about her, but I'll try to keep it brief. The main reason why I love her so much is her love of horror movies, and she has so much horror knowledge, and I really connected to her because she's a teenager, and when I was very young, I grew up watching tons of horror movies, and a lot of the kids, a lot of my friends and like a lot of schoolmates, right? They were always perplexed. It's like, why are you watching all these horror movies? Because they would always talk about like whatever like PG movie that they were watching, or like a new Disney or Pixar movie, and I'm over here like, did you guys see Nightmare on Elm Street 5? And they're like, what? But yeah, she's amazing, and just the book overall just is amazing, and I love Stephen Graham Jones. This might be my favorite Stephen Graham Jones book. My Heart is a Chainsaw. 5 stars. I'll try to I'll try to keep this brief, but I do love Jade, and I love My Heart is a Chainsaw. One of my most anticipated reads of the year that did not disappoint me, of course, was The Night She Disappeared by Lisa Jewell. At this point, I can almost predict with pretty much like 99% confidence level that I'm going to end up giving her books 5 stars. They're just so good. Like I said, basically the same thing with Invisible Girl, which I talked about earlier in this video. Amazing character work. She just has the ability to create such atmosphere with the book. And even though sometimes her books are predictable, that's not why I read her books. I just really get engrossed into the world, into like the setting that she creates, and just I love Lisa Jewell, y'all. She's the top 10 author, and I will basically read anything she writes. And I'm even contemplating reading her books that aren't mysteries and thrillers, because she started out more as like a contemporary romance author. I'm even contemplating reading those. I don't anticipate loving them as much as I do her mysteries and thrillers, but just, man, Lisa Jewell is awesome. And this book, no exception, 5 stars easily. And the last and final book, the 28th book, if I counted these correctly, which who knows if I did or not. But the last and final book that I will talk about is The Child Thief by Brahm, which this was recommended to me by Joanna, and I'm very glad that she decided to recommend it to me because it's on this video, so it's one of my favorite books that I've read this year. Not perfect, right? But I did give it 4.5 stars. And the reason I wanted to pick it up was because she recommended it to me, and she said she was listening to it on audiobook. And so I looked up the audiobook, and it happened to be narrated by Kirby Hayborn, which is one of probably my favorite audiobook narrator of all time. So I immediately went and picked up the audiobook and started listening to it and was loving it right away. So I picked up a paperback copy, and the paperback copy is really cool because it also has illustrations in it, which I think are done by the author. And so this book was just very good, a very dark and gruesome retelling of Peter Pan. And like the end of this book, I think a theme with books that I love this year are like they go in directions that I don't anticipate them going in. And there are, Peter Pan like tropes, right? Where you've got Peter Pan and then you've got people, you know, if you know Peter Pan, you know what I'm talking about. But the end of the book kind of just goes in directions that I'm just like, oh yeah, that's a pretty cool twist on things. And just, yeah, this book in general is really good, and I'm really eager to read more by Brom. So yeah, that's the last book I'll talk about here. 4.5 stars. Yeah. All right, those are all of the books I wanted to talk about for this video. Happy birthday to me. Now I have to edit all of this. So yeah, those are the 28 favorite books from me that I've read so far this year that are not rereads. Yeah, I read a lot of great books this year, y'all. This has been an amazing year for me personally, both reading wise and just for the channel in general. Wow, I've done so much talking that I'm just blending words together. But yeah, this video was fun to make, and I hope y'all enjoy it, and hopefully y'all can get some recommendations from me as well. Like I said, these are my favorite books that I've read so far this year. Now I still have all of November and December left, so like I said, my end of the year videos might be a little different. They might have some inclusions from November and December, and then, you know, some of these books might... Whew, I'm tired, y'all. This is a long video to make. Hopefully I can edit it down so it's not like a long ass video. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you guys have read any of these books, and if you enjoyed them or if you didn't enjoy them. Let me know down in the comments below. And just in general, what have been your favorite books that you've read so far this year? I would love to chat about it in the comments with you, so please feel free to do so. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and to the Bookerstormer Discord. And if you would like to further support me, you can check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and have a terrific day.